right, we have just a few more people coming in. All right, so we're going to start actually. So I would like to introduce myself. I'm not sure that that you all may know who I am. My name is Ruth Stearns Mandel, and I am the e-learning and the communications manager, and I am also David's partner. When COVID first hit, and so many practitioners were casting about for ways to be able to help survivors, we returned to a lot of ways that we have done things which don't serve all survivors. And so what I'm speaking of is a mainly carceral response to domestic violence. And there's been much discussion and a lot of research in the domestic violence field about why we have poor responses to domestic violence. And though there is a tremendous amount of differing factors that play into that, so I'm not going to claim that this is all the factor. One of the main factors that has not been well discussed within the domestic violence field or the adjacent fields of police and law enforcement response to domestic violence, we have not actually addressed the reality of police criminality. When I first began looking into this issue, because as a survivor, I identified it and believed that it was a fundamental and critical failure at the beginning of systems where we gather evidence, where we have on-the-ground responses to domestic violence, that was impeding justice, safety, and good practice. If you think about the ecosystems around survivors and the way that systems respond to survivors as being indicative of the supports that they feel that they have, or the challenges and the threats that are in their lives, not just from the perpetrator, but also from systems that potentially may not have good practice, may have adversarial practice, or may actually have perpetrators who are responding to domestic violence calls and domestic violence cases. When you think about that as being a factor, it becomes incredibly frustrating to think about us being able to do good practice from there, because police response hinges all the next responses in systems. The evidence gathered, the recommendations made, the response of law enforcement once they're involved is the measure by which professionals view safety and the next steps. But if you have 65% retention of domestic violence perpetrators on police forces, you have a 2 in 5 chance of a perpetrator responding to your domestic violence call. So could domestic violence poor responses by law enforcement be tied to the fact that there is a high level of domestic violence perpetration in police? To me, this seems like a very reasonable question to ask. And it was one that I asked of Alex Roslin, who is an award-winning journalist and who has been looking at officer-involved domestic violence and its impacts on immediate victims, but it impacts on the ecosystem, the response to domestic violence and sexual assault survivors. And he was very generous with his time, and he's incredibly knowledgeable, and he has been doing this for almost 25 years and knows most of the major reformers within police and law enforcement that have been working on this issue. And he's going to help us to connect those links, how policing and officer-involved domestic violence impacts the ecosystem of the response to domestic violence victims and survivors, and impedes our ability to get justice, to be safe, and to have a good and holistic response to domestic violence. So I am going to introduce Alex Roslin, and I will pop back in at the end to do a couple of hooking up of how this links up to safe and together practice. So Shaniqua, if you could bring Alex in as the main presenter, that would be awesome.
Sure, give me just 1 minute to switch over. Okay, Alex, I think you can take it away.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ruth and Shaniqua. Thank you for the very kind introduction, and to you and David for putting this session together. As you said, this is a very important issue that's just very, very poorly understood among even among domestic violence professionals, counselors and advocates. So I thought I'd start by, I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a Canadian journalist based in Quebec. I was president of the board of the Canadian Centre for Investigative Reporting. I worked as an associate producer for our Canadian CBC investigative program, our sort of version of 60 Minutes. I've won many investigative journalism awards, and I've written a book about this issue that we're talking about today called Police Wife. That's available on Amazon. So that book has won a number of awards internationally and in the United States and Canada. And it's in its second edition now. So that second edition came out in 2017, but I've actually been writing about this and researching it since about the year 2000. And I thought it might be interesting to tell you how I got involved in this, because it's kind of a, it's an unusual issue perhaps to be so singularly attached to. And I found myself, continually being roped back into it because of its gravity and its wider social implications for domestic violence response, as Ruth said, but as well for police interactions with civilians, and including African Americans, Indigenous people, female motorists, all sorts of really bad stories of interactions with civilians. So it has implications for the entire society beyond just police families. So what prompted me was actually a friend who was in a domestic violence support group, and she told me something quite surprising, that about half the people who were in the group, they were people who were survivors of domestic violence. They were intimate partners or former partners of criminal biker gang members, and the other half approximately were with police officers. And it just really struck me, and I thought I should look into that. I was just so surprised that it just really wasn't on my radar, although I had done a lot of reporting about criminal justice and all sorts of other issues, corruption, but nothing like this had ever come on my radar. And so right away after calling, a number of professional domestic violence advocates or counselors, even police officers themselves, psychologists and so on, it was quite clear that there was a big problem that was sort of an open, almost like secret, but quite hidden, hidden from public view. And almost immediately after I started looking into this, there was a particularly gruesome incident that occurred in Montreal that really kind of galvanized my attention even more. And I'll go into a few details about this what happened, because I think it's very instructive about the gravity of what can happen. So it concerns an officer of Canada's largest police force, the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which polices across the country, and on sort of like our federal, our FBI, but also they serve as local police in many provinces. So there was an officer there, a veteran officer, and he had a past, quite a past. His name is Jocelyn Ott, and he had previously been disciplined for stalking a fellow RCMP officer with whom he had a short relationship, and couldn't come to terms with that ending. So he had stalked her for about 6 months. He tailed her on the highway, knocked on her door multiple times a day. accosted her in parking lots, even attacked another police officer in a courthouse, no less, who had greeted her with, a casual kiss on both cheeks that's very common in Quebec. So this woman actually was so harassed by this man that she quit the RCMP and actually moved to another province to get away. But even there, he tracked her down again and drove by her home a few times. And so when this came to light, the RCMP's reaction was not to fire him. They simply ordered him to get counseling for depression and put him on administrative duties for a brief time without his gun. But his career wasn't affected. In fact, he was admitted into the elite VIP protection squad of the RCMP, where he guarded politicians and visiting leaders like President George W. Bush. He received special training in weapons and driving tactics, and even qualified as a crack shot. So fast forward a little bit, and he met a young woman, mother of 3 in Montreal, Lucie Gélinas was her name, and they went out and then broke up. But Jocelyn Hutt couldn't accept this breakup, so he started stalking her as well, and waiting outside her apartment. She was quite terrified. She would call home many times a day to check if her kids were okay. And at one point, he threatened to kill her. So Lucie Gélinas called 911 in tears to report the threat, and told the 911 operator that this man was in the RCMP, that he was crazy, and that she was really scared. So responding municipal police came to her place, and she even told them about the previous stalking of the female Mountie, and that Jocelyn Hutt was acting strangely and depressed. But these officers came and left. They wrote nothing. They didn't write a police report. All they did was write in their log for the night, unfounded, no threat. They didn't contact Jocelyn Hutt. They didn't contact the RCMP to verify Hutt's background. They didn't tell the RCMP about the incident, and of course his gun wasn't taken away. So a week later, Hutt was waiting outside Gélinas' home, and when she and a couple of 3 other people, a neighbor and 2 others, entered the car, her car, and they were just going to go out for the evening. So Hutt opened fire on them. He followed them and opened fire with his police gun on one of Canada's busiest highways in Montreal, and riddled their car with bullets. He emptied 2 magazines into their car. The chase, incidentally, was recorded on a 911 cell phone call made by one of the passengers. And so he fatally shot Lucie Gélinas. He hit her actually 5 times. Another passenger was shot 4 times, and the other 2 were also seriously wounded. One of them was left paraplegic. So Hutt was charged with first-degree murder and 3 counts of attempted murder. The Crown offered him actually a 16-year prison sentence. So that might not seem like a lot, but Hutt thought that it was too much. So he actually rejected that and insisted on only 14 years. He offered to plead guilty to manslaughter. The Crown refused, the Crown prosecution, and so it went to a trial, which the jury found him guilty on all counts, sentenced to life with no chance of parole for 25 years. But Jocelyn Hutt, couldn't accept that either, so he appealed all the way to Canada's Supreme Court, and lost. And so all the parties in the actual trial agreed. The judge, the prosecution, even Jocelyn Hutt's own defense lawyers all agreed that the responding police should have done more to take this woman's complaint more seriously. And so in the end, the responding police agency, well, it's responsible police municipality had to settle with the 3 wounded passengers in a legal settlement. But the police agency and the RCMP, I discovered, didn't actually change anything in their policies. And it appears that even the officers, the responding police officers, weren't disciplined for their inaction. So I was really struck by this case, as you can imagine, and I wanted to know what had gone wrong. How could this have happened? And this was a large part of the reason I decided to write this book and look into the similar cases, in Canada and in the United States and worldwide. Actually, most of the book is centered on incidents and research based in the United States. So that is the sort of the main focus of the book, although I talk a lot about Canada and other countries as well. But this case of Jocelyn Huot and Lucie Gélinas really kind of underlines the themes that I discovered and that are important, I think, for professionals, who are working on domestic violence to be aware of. And that is that responding officers tend to ignore abuse complaints like they did in this case. The officers who are, caught, most of them aren't, but the ones who are caught face lax discipline, often not affecting their career, often even being promoted. And even when it affects fellow officers, and that's another theme, that when one officer is violent and other officers sort of get sucked into this, either by covering up for that person or even being themselves targets of violence, as we saw in this case of Jocelyn Huot, and who assaulted the other officer. And then another theme is that this violence, because of the very powerful and public role of police in our society, this violence affects other people. It affects the safety of civilians, and so think about the people who could have been hurt on the highway by Jocelyn Huot's shooting spree, with unloading 2 police magazines on a very, very busy highway. So those are some of the themes that it's important to reflect upon when encountering these kinds of cases in your work. So as I started to research this, I discovered that the rate of abuse in police families or police relationships is really of staggering proportions. The data we have is not, the greatest. It's limited only to the United States, for one thing. And the sort of the better studies, or the initial, I should say, studies were done in the 1990s, and those are the ones that are the most striking. But they are very striking, and we have reason to believe that the sort of prevalence of the abuse is similar in other countries, and as well hasn't most likely changed in any material way since the 90s. So 2 major sets of studies were done by very credible groups of researchers. One was an eminent sociologist who later served on an FBI advisory board on police stress. And the other group of studies was done by 2 members of the Tucson Police Department, including a very decorated police detective there, and another researcher who had studied domestic violence in the military. And so from their research, what they found is that, sort of reflecting what Ruth said, that about 40% in one of the studies, 40% of officers acknowledged that they had, and this is in quotes here, gotten out of control and behaved violently toward a spouse or child in the previous 6 months. So that's sort of the definition of domestic violence that was used in that one study. but I draw your attention to although the definition could encapsulate, could point to different kinds of violence, and has been critiqued a little bit for that. What's especially important is that this is just in the previous 6 months. So this is a very short time frame, and you could imagine that the rate would be much higher if we included, say, 12 months or a year, 5 years, let's say. And as well, this is self-acknowledged violence, and as you know, that tends to be conservative. The other study, or set of studies, found that this is by the Arizona police members, or police agency members, that 28% of male police officers, this was across several police departments across the United States, in both cases of these studies. So 28% of in this other study of male officers had admitted that they had been violent toward a spouse at least once in the previous year. This is physically violent. So very, very striking statistics. I mean, you're 3 in 10, 4 in 10 officers admitting themselves that they had perpetrated domestic violence. And when I saw that kind of number, I mean, you just have to, when you're driving around and you see police officers going by in a squad car, after you hear those kinds of numbers, you wonder, I mean, is this one of the 2 in 5 or the 3 in 10? They're just such high numbers. If you have 2 officers responding to a domestic violence call, those, the chance that either one of them could be a perpetrator goes up, obviously, because each one of them has those same odds, right? And the rates of violence went up even more among officers who were younger. So 64% of officers who were in their 20s reported domestic violence, either by themselves or by their intimate partner in the previous year. And 66% of divorced or legally separated officers reported domestic violence in their relationship in the previous year. So I did some, sort of attempts to compare that to what the public rates are. And those rates are, up to 15 times higher than what's reported in the wider population. So dramatically higher. Now, what's also just quite staggering is how very, very little domestic violence actually gets reported to police agencies themselves by involving their own members. If the rates were even just the same as in the wider population, which most police officers acknowledge that, there is some domestic violence among their members, and even the most conservative ones will generally acknowledge it's probably mirrors what's happening in the wider population. So just taking that much, much lower rate, if you look at actually the number of allegations that are reported to police agencies, it's actually as little as 1 in 100 of if we use the rate it's in the wider population. In other words, if it should be 100 times higher if it was actually just the same as the rate in the wider population. But in fact, if the amount of domestic violence is actually as high as it seems to be from these various studies, then it's actually only 1 in 2,000 cases of domestic violence are actually coming to the attention of police forces in the form of an allegation. It depends, of course, on the agency, but it can be as low as that. So it's just amazing how there is such a huge problem. There's so very, very little coming to the attention of police agencies, and as we'll see later, it's even the very, very few portion of cases that are coming to the attention of police agencies are actually being acted on. I also asked myself, and looked into why the rates are so high. And I think it's important to think about that a little bit. And police officers themselves were some of my best sources for a lot of this information and understanding problems, and many of them obviously are not committing domestic violence, and many are actually very concerned about these problems. One particular group of police officers that is like that is the women police associations. They are often very, very strong advocates for better action on these issues, and can be a very good ally, incidentally, for anyone who is looking for an ally like that. So, and they helped me identify and this comes from research as well, that generally there were three main issues that were causing such a high rate of violence. One is that police officers have a tremendous amount of power, and this coincides with the issue that domestic violence is generally seen as an attempt to control. It's not a loss of control, it's an attempt to impose control on someone else. And that's really at the heart of the job of policing, is controlling other individuals in sort of unruly situations, right? That's what a lot of the training and even the personality of police officers sort of dovetails with that. And that's literally what police officers themselves say. It's a controlling profession. Is sort of in a sense what they say. Well, quite literally, actually, in one FBI study on this issue. A second issue is the impunity, the lack of action, so they can just get away with it. And a third issue is derogatory attitudes towards women. And of course, in the United States, only 12% of police officers are women. So, you can see right from that statistic that there is a problem with the hiring of women, and that reflects to a large extent that those derogatory attitudes towards women. So what happens when police officers or police departments do hear about these allegations? Very little, I found. Only 32%, so a third of police officers who are convicted of a misdemeanor domestic assault actually lost their job, according to a more recent study. So that means that, and this is yet another surprising thing that I learned, is that, and I think most people in the public would be quite surprised that there are many police officers walking around with criminal convictions, and including for domestic violence. There was an LAPD investigation that gave us a really amazing first look at these statistics in 1997. It was actually prompted by the murder by an LAPD officer of his estranged wife and her new boyfriend, and then the officer subsequently committed suicide. And so there was a wrongful death suit, and that led to an LAPD Inspector General inquiry into the broader issues. So they found that over a period of about 7 years, there were about 90 upheld investigations of LAPD officers for domestic violence. So that's 90 out of about 230 allegations that had been made. So about 40% were upheld. So of those 90, though, only 20% led to a criminal charge. And of the 90, only 4% led to a conviction. And only one officer out of the 90 was actually fired. So the most common discipline was not termination. It was suspension for 1 to 4 days, or simply an admonishment. You're a bad boy or a bad girl, and that's it. And over 75% of the abusive officers had no mention of a sustained complaint, even in their performance records. And 29% got a promotion after the sustained complaint. Now, some people will, some people who want to minimize these issues will say, well, these, the studies were done in the 1990s, the prevalent studies of, how bad it is. Of course, we have a better understanding of domestic violence now. We've improved police procedures, so it must be better. But in fact, right now, it's actually they're by some measures worse than it was in the 1990s. More recently, fewer domestic violence allegations are being sustained than they were in the 90s. So in the LAPD investigation, it was 40% were sustained. In the latest data that I had access to, it was less than a quarter. So it was 23% were sustained. So by some measures, we're actually doing a worse job now than we were doing in the 90s. And today, the data says, this same data, this says that police officers have 3 times higher chance of being terminated for an off-duty altercation than for domestic violence, and a 6 times higher chance for making a false statement. And that's a similar, you can find that kind of data in your local police agency as well. It's the same similar kind of problem exists in the RCMP in Canada, and as well in Florida. A newspaper investigation found that domestic violence there in the state of Florida among police officers is one of the least sort of most mildly disciplined of any misconduct. Officers had 28 times more chance of being terminated if they had failed a marijuana test. Sorry, I was just reading my data here, but that's to me, and theft, of course, is again more strictly punished as well. So I found this data to be just very, very troubling. And so the question is, what impacts does this kind of violence have outside police families? Now, domestic violence is one of the most common reasons for calls to police, in many communities. And the question is, what happens when officers themselves are abusers? And that question, as we pointed out in the introduction, was what prompted the FBI to actually hold a fairly important conference, and then issue a kind of a landmark report about this about 20 years ago. They were talking about how domestic violence response among police is quite inadequate. And so they wondered, is it connected to abuse in police homes, and which resulted in officers sort of misunderstanding or deliberately responding inappropriately, botching investigations and so on, or minimizing the abuse, pressuring the complainant to not file a complaint, or what have you, that kind of pressure. And so we've seen that kind of connection made in various other reports. There was a Department of Justice investigation of the Puerto Rico Police Department that highlighted that connection. In Australia as well, there was a government inquiry that highlighted this, and in the UK, there have been inquiries making this very important connection. So in improving response to domestic violence among police, it's obvious that the issue of domestic violence in police relationships must be addressed. And then other issues that where this has an impact beyond police families include excessive force against civilians and against fellow officers. So one of those early studies in the 1990s found a strong correlation between the rates of domestic violence in police relationships and the use by that same officer of excessive force against civilians and even against fellow officers. And another study that was done more recently found that 20% of US police officers arrested for domestic violence had previously been named in at least one federal court civil rights lawsuit. Another area where there's a very important troubling impact is in sexual misconduct. And so another study based on FBI data found that US police officers committed over 2 times more sexual assaults per capita than the general population. And minors made up 52% of the alleged survivors of serious sexual misconduct by police officers, such as sexual assault or battery. And that the reason I say alleged is because that study was based on, I believe, news reports that included allegations. And but in those news reports, 52% of the complainants were minors. They hadn't been sustained, but it's still very, very troubling problems. And as we saw in the case of Zeslan Ut, and as well as occurred in the case of the LAPD killing that prompted the investigation there, there are wrongful death lawsuits that often will arise in these kinds of cases. Since the second edition of my book came out in 2017, I've been tracking just by news reports other murders that involve police officers, and my file now contains, I believe it's over 40, almost all in the United States. So that would be a police officer murdering a former or current intimate partner, and then in some cases committing suicide or even killing other people as well. So a huge liability in these wrongful death suits for all people who pay taxes in those areas. So I just wanted to, I don't know how much time we have here, but I wanted to just sort of end with sort of some of the unique and very important challenges that survivors of this kind of violence face. And it's important because the people working in this field often are aware of these challenges and will follow often the sort of typical advice that is given to these survivors, but that kind of advice will sometimes and very often not work very well. And there's a counselor named Diane Wettendorf who used to, she's retired now, but she has an excellent website that has a lot of, sort of resources for survivors of police domestic violence. And she has actually an annotated safety plan. She took the trouble, she had so many, counseling clients who kept encountering the same kind of flawed advice, that she took it upon herself to take a regular safety plan and annotate it. And almost every sort of piece of advice that's normally given to survivors comes with a caveats or sort of asterisks, or in fact, like, don't do this kind of advice. So for example, advice is sometimes just to call 911, but an OIDV survivor, excuse me for the abbreviation, officer involved domestic violence survivor, it will not always feel that's good advice. She may be worried about what the responding officers will say. A common tactic is that the officer will say, who's going to believe you? It's my friend who's going to come answer the call. She may not be ready for that call. That might be the problem. She may just need to wait for the right time to be safe. In most of the cases I've dealt with, the women are terrified. These are men who have guns. They have training, in using physical force without leaving marks. They intimidate these women into tremendous fear. They'll just put the simple thing as putting their gun on the table when they're eating dinner. All it takes is sometimes just the look. And so these women have very few places to turn. The usual sort of avenues, shelters, and calling the police often aren't available. Their officer husband may know where all the shelters are in the area, may have other police resources they can call upon to track down this woman, even if she flees. And it can recruit all, some of the other officers to like drive by her house from time to time to intimidate her. So other advice is, ask, a common advice told to other survivors is ask your neighbor to call police if you hear a disturbance. Well, again, this might not be the right tactic for OIDV survivor. She may not be ready for that or want it or feel that that's gonna be safe for her. So there's a lot of these kinds of variations that are important to be aware of. I think that I wanted to leave time for questions and for Ruth to jump in and add any other comments of her own. So maybe I could stop there and we can continue.
So Alex, thank you so much. I'm going to just make a couple of comments and share my screen so that, Shaniqua, am I sharing my screen right now or no?
Nope, not yet.
Okay. So one of the reasons that we wanted to address this issue is Alex put it in really good terms. This is an ecosystemic crime. We have a mandate in the United States to arrest for domestic violence, but police are subverting that mandate via internal investigations and caring for their own, essentially, in a culture which has a high level of violence, anti-women, and anti-Black, anti-immigrant sentiments. This is not benign. 75% of police who perpetrate violence against their families and admitted it, so that's a self-admitted data point, also admitted to harming civilians. So domestic violence and civil rights violations have an intimate link. As a system problem, if you think about all of the actions that happen after a domestic violence victim calls a police officer, the evidence that's gathered, the discretionary ability of that officer to arrest or to recommend that to go forward for prosecution, and you think of that person being a perpetrator of domestic violence, then you understand some of those huge impacts. I'm going to share my screen because we did some work on the sort of ecosystem impact of this so that you all could kind of get a sense of why it was that Safe and Together felt that this was an important piece. Officer-involved domestic violence doesn't just impact its victim. Again, it's an ecosystemic crime. There is immediate impact to their victim and to their family. And I can tell you, after having advocated for OIDV survivors, that these are the most endangered and abandoned women. Many advocates will not work with them. Their perpetrator walks into family court in their uniform, into criminal court with their uniform. They have relationships with prosecutors. They have relationships with judges. They use their position of power to manipulate systems to continue to harm and control their victims. And it erodes our ability to trust that the system is functioning properly. So this is a public trust, public safety issue. The impact to the victims of similar crimes, which they respond to dangerously or poorly. The impact to civilians due to increased risk for excessive force or civil rights violations or sexual assaults, which is another component of this. The impact to police systems via liability. Right now, there's a case that you should be watching. The unfortunate death of a child. His name is Thomas Valva, and I want to speak his name. And his father was an officer in New York, and there was extensive documentation as to the harm that this child was experiencing from mandated reporters as well as from his mother. But because he was a police officer and he had these relationships and he could manipulate the system, he was not held accountable and his child froze to death. And now there is a $200 million lawsuit. This is a huge impact to the budgets. If you think of police as receiving almost 82% of OVW funding, and only 12% goes to services, and yet police retain 65% of domestic violence perpetrators, then you understand that we may be in a relationship where most of our funding is being controlled by people who are not actually on board with the message that domestic violence is not okay. So its impact to coworkers and the safety and well-being of those coworkers. We only have about 12% of female police in the United States. In other countries, we have more female police. But there is a huge problem with sexual assault and domestic abuse within those relationships. Police often marry police because their culture is the same. Leonore Boulain Johnson, who is an amazing researcher, who was the seminal researcher in this area, has done extensive work on police culture, mental health, well-being, trauma, and she advocates, even though domestic violence is, mental health issues do not cause domestic violence, there is a correlation that if we were to care for the mental health and well-being, even just doing basic screening for mental health before we hire a police officer, that we could reduce these rates. And she echoes the sentiments of Alex. And she is an expert witness for Congress and for the FBI and works on police reform. Her assessment is that actually we are in more danger than we were before. That the militarization of police, the lack of accountability and impunity, the lack of data and research sharing has led to a very dangerous situation, and that is not just for domestic violence victims and their children. It's actually for all of us. And that's why Safe and Together felt that this was a very important issue that we needed to bring to the attention of our systems, because we are about systems change. And the framework that we use actually can be overlaid on mapping perpetrators' patterns of abuses of power and control. If you think about the way that perpetrators behave within systems, then you can see how this would have a very negative impact on the function of systems to respond to domestic violence when there's a high level of perpetrators that are feeding into that system. We wanted to address this because our commitment is to systems change for families. We recognize that systems need to be fixed, not survivors, not victims, but systems. And police themselves, excuse me, I totally rolled ahead here as I was doing great. And police themselves need to commit themselves to equality, safety, and appropriate policing within minority communities. And there's a lot of police voices in the mix that are calling for that. Police responses and reporting directly impact child protection. If we have children in the home and police respond inappropriately to a domestic violence situation or victim blame that victim, we already have a system that is going to respond off of the evidence that was poorly gathered or not gathered at all, or even false evidence that was gathered, which is something that we do see. The application of a perpetrator pattern-based approach can be applied to OIDV. And the intersections framework, we can look at trauma and abuse, because we do need to support police families. In fact, their families are suffering very, very deeply because of the lack of support. And this is a failure on the part of policing and on the part of society. Our support of the advocate community and specialized advocacy issues is what we're hopeful for, is that we can bring this awareness to advocates and train them a little bit better and how to advocate for these really marginalized, extremely vulnerable survivors when there is a lot of power and control and misuse of power. So Safe and Together is committed to talking about this issue and continuing to bring it forward and help people to understand with awareness why it's a problem and what the solutions are, because there are solutions. And the IACP has already, the International Association of Chiefs of Police has already recommended changes and we need to move forward on that. We have done a full 4-part series on officer-involved domestic violence with all of the major reform professionals within policing, with Leonore Bullen Johnson, the seminal researcher, with an OIDV survivor. We have also created a podcast of the super complaint in the UK, because this is not an issue that is just pertinent to the United States. Our culture of policing was exported internationally around the world, as was our culture of child protection. And so we see similarities no matter where we go. In Australia, police have similar issues. In the UK, police have similar issues. In Canada, police have similar issues. In France, police have similar issues. And even though this can be a very difficult thing to understand and very disheartening, the fact that there are similarities allows for us to find similar fixes for this problem. So I'm really going to encourage you to read Alex's book, listen to the podcast, and if you would like to contact Alex, this is his contact information. I would recommend that you do go to Diane Wentendorf's website, because it does have a lot of really good safety planning information. You really cannot give the same safety planning information to victims of OIDV as you do to regular domestic violence victims. And now I'm just going to open it up. I know we're running a little bit late, but I'm going to open it up if anybody would like to ask questions of Alex or myself. Please do. All right, Alex, I am really, really grateful for you and for all of your work. And what I do have to say is that I know that Alex spends hours of his time responding to and guiding OIDV victims who don't have any support. And so you are a true advocate and a true ally. And I am just incredibly grateful to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Ruth. I know you're doing the same kind of work, and I applaud you and your team there for what you're doing. There needs to be more people like you guys.
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us.
Yes.
Yes, and if anybody has questions, I can forward them on to Alex, or you can email him directly. All right, and I think we have a few-minute break where we actually ended 1 minute before we were supposed to, which is amazing because I could talk for hours. All right, everybody, thank you and be well.
Thank you so much, everyone.